Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is video number 11, as my count goes. I think that's correct. As we are continuing our debunking of Brock Hollett's book, Debunking Preterism. Mr. Hollett says he was once a preterist but has changed his mind. He is now a historic premillennialist, as I understand it. And in the book, he sets out to show why the preterist view of eschatology, the fulfilled view of eschatology, cannot be correct. And on pages 38 and following, he spends almost 5 pages in seeking to explain Matthew 24:14. Jesus said in his explanation of the prediction of the fall of Jerusalem and the temple, when the disciples asked, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of your coming in and of the end of the age?" Now, as I'm pointing out in our regular study of the Olivet Discourse, commentators such as Mr. Hollett take it for granted. They take it for granted without proof that the disciples were asking about an end of time, universe destroying coming of Jesus out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man riding a cumulus cloud, as I am wont to express it. They never prove it, they assume it. But I hope you'll go back and I hope you'll watch this week's videos. Be sure to watch yesterday's video in which I discussed Zephaniah. Because the question is, when the disciples asked about Jesus' parousia, where would they have ever gotten the idea that the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event? They were Jews couched in the Old Testament. They knew that Jerusalem had been destroyed in 586 BC. They knew that it was called the day of the Lord. They knew that it was described as the destruction of heaven and earth. But they knew that it wasn't the destruction of heaven and earth. They knew it was not the coming of God out of heaven, literally, visibly, and bodily. And so therefore, when Jesus said that the temple was going to be destroyed again, that's the background. So be sure to watch yesterday's video in which I demonstrate from the book of Zephaniah, graphically, powerfully, uses the language, the day of the Lord is at hand. And it describes the destruction of material creation, seemingly so. But it certainly was not the end of time. And it was not the coming of God, literally, visibly, and bodily out of heaven. Folks, that's the prophetic background. That's the historical background to the disciples' questions in Matthew 24. So when Mr. Hollett assumes, without any kind of a proof whatsoever, that the disciples were asking about the end of the current Christian age, the end of time, he's got to prove that the disciples had that in mind and not the Old Testament concept. But to continue, the disciples asked Jesus about a sign of the end of the age. Jesus said this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations, then comes the end. Well, again, on page 38 and following, Mr. Hollett says, preterists argue that the Great Commission was fulfilled. Now, what is absolutely stunning, but it's common by Mr. Hollett, he spends his time, and I've called attention to this in an earlier video, trying to prove that the Bible doesn't mean what the Bible says. You could rename this book, Why the Bible Doesn't Mean What the Bible Says. And the reason I say that is this. Now, listen very carefully. He calls attention to the fact that preterists point out that Paul said the gospel had been preached in all the world. He points out that Paul said the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. He says the gospel had been preached in all of the world and was bringing forth fruit in all the world. And Mr. Hollett says, well, that can't be true. And he said, first, unlike the verse under consideration, Matthew 24:14, these Pauline epistles or passages simply cannot emphasis his, be understood literally and should be taken figuratively. Now this is amazing. The language of Jesus coming on the clouds with the sound of a trumpet and flaming fire cannot be taken figuratively according to Mr. Hollett, even though that's the way the language is used consistently without exception in the Old Testament. So that language of the coming of the Lord on the clouds absolutely must be taken literally. But when Paul the apostle said that the gospel had been preached into all the world, oh, that can't be taken literally. Now here's a question for you. Was Paul aware of Jesus' prediction? Well, of course he was. It was his mandate. Paul got his mandate to go preach to the nations from Jesus himself. Acts 21, Acts 22. Jesus called him to go to the nations, to preach to the Gentiles. Well, if Paul got his doctrine of the Great Commission from Jesus, then he knew what Jesus meant when Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Paul knew who the nations were. He knew what the Great Commission was. And that very same apostle, given the Great Commission by Jesus, yes, he did in fact say, their sound, the sound of the ministers preaching the gospel into all the world, had gone forth and had been proclaimed in all the world. Now here's something amazing. Pardon me. Every single word that Jesus used to describe and to command the preaching of the gospel into all of the world, Greek word cosmos, is used by Paul to say it had been done. When Jesus used the word, preach the gospel to every creature, Greek word katisis, Mark 16, 15, and 16, Paul used that word in Colossians 1, 23 to say it had been preached to every creature. When Jesus said, go preach the gospel into all of the nations, Paul used that same identical word, ethnoi, nations, to say the gospel had been preached to all the nations. Let me reiterate that. You really have to catch the power of that. Every single word that Jesus used to either predict or to command the preaching of the gospel into all the nations, into all the world, into all the earth, to every creature, etc., is used by Paul to say it had been done. But you know what's rather remarkable? Mr. Hollett spends these 5 pages trying to show that, well, yes, Jesus used the word cosmos, and yes, Paul used the word cosmos, but Paul's using it in a radically different way. Really? Remember, Paul got his commission from Jesus. He knew what the words meant. Mr. Hollett goes so far as to argue in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23, when Paul said the gospel has been preached to every creature under heaven. Oh, Mr. Hollett tells us that's hyperbole. That's figurative language. And he appeals to John Piper. John Piper says, well, the aorist tense that is used there in Colossians 1 and verse 23 is a substantival participle translated as proclaimed. And it's in the aorist tense. Oh, but you see, according to Mr. Piper, he said what that really means is it's just defining the gospel that is being preached. Well, here's the problem with Mr. Piper, and here's the problem with Mr. Hollett. On BibleGateway.com, go there, type in Colossians 1:23. There you can search every single English translation available. I did that before filming this morning. I found a grand total of 3 translations that might sort of, kind of, maybe be understood in the way that Mr. Hollett wants us to understand it. But you have to kind of work at it to make it mean that. In all other 57 of the 60 translations, unless I missed another one or two, it is translated has been preached or has been proclaimed. Now remember, Paul got his gospel, Paul got his understanding of the Great Commission from Jesus. He didn't define a different commission. He didn't redefine the words. He used them. He used the very words that Jesus used. And there's another critical point that I have to share this morning that you absolutely must catch the power of this point. Remember, Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom must be preached into all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. Now the disciples asked for a sign of his coming, right? Jesus said the fulfillment of the Great Commission would be a sign of the end. Then comes the end. Okay. In Romans, in Colossians, in Titus, and oh, by the way, in Revelation, throughout the New Testament, we have the declaration of the fulfilled gospel. Oh, and as a sideline here, most of you know I don't appeal to the patristics all that often. I certainly don't consider them inspired. But do you realize that virtually almost all of the early patristic writers declared that the gospel had been preached into all the world? Yeah, they did. Anyway, that's a different issue. Here's my point. In the Pauline epistles, Peter, John, and Revelation all declare that the gospel had been preached to all the nations, to all the world, to every creature. And based upon that fulfillment, based upon the reality that the gospel had been preached to all the nations, Paul declared, the end of the ages has come upon us. The time has been shortened. Peter declared, the end of all things has drawn near. Hebrews declared, and now in a very, very little while the one who is coming will come and will not tarry. James wrote, the parousia of the Lord has drawn near. John wrote, these things must shortly come to pass. And Jesus himself said, behold, I come quickly. Do you catch the power of that? Jesus said, when the gospel has been preached as a witness into all the world, as a witness to the nations, then comes the end. The New Testament writers, writing later in that very generation, said the gospel had been preached to all of the nations, to every creature, and the end had drawn near. And thus, Mr. Hollett is forced into a rather embarrassing position. Number one, of totally redefining the words that Jesus used, of denying the emphatic statements by Paul, and then making figurative all of this language. The day of the Lord has drawn near. The parousia has drawn near. Mr. Hollett turns the testimony of the Bible upside down. Now I want you to know something. I wrote a book years ago, Into All the World, Then Comes the End. In this book, I have what I've shared with you this morning and a ton more about the fulfillment of the Great Commission in the first century. And by the way, I completely debunk Mr. Hollett's claim, well, if the Great Commission was fulfilled in the first century, there's no motive, there's no incentive, there's no reason for preaching the gospel today. That is a facile, illogical, and unscriptural position with no merit whatsoever. And I explain all of that in this book. Okay? Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order the book, Into All the World, Then Comes the End. You will see the power of the New Testament testimony of the fulfillment of Jesus' prediction and command. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I do appreciate you being with me. You have a very safe weekend. God bless. I'll see you on Monday.